Let's start with a sound. Not a weapon, not an explosion, a sound. This is Redacted Skies, the declassified stories the Cold War left buried. Picture a NATO fighter pilot in the 1970s, somewhere over the North Atlantic, scrambling to intercept an unidentified contact. His radar's picking up something big, something slow, and before he even gets a visual, he hears it. A deep, rolling growl vibrating through his own cockpit, arriving before the airplane does. That's not supposed to happen. Radar is supposed to see things before your ears do. But this aircraft broke that rule constantly, because the propellers on the tips were moving faster than the speed of sound. Every flight, every mission, on purpose. This is the Tupolev Tu-95. NATO called it the Bear. And it is, without question, one of the strangest success stories in aviation history, because almost nothing about it should have worked. And yet here we are, in the 2020s, watching the same basic airframe design still flying combat missions. So today, we're not doing the version of this story you've already heard. We're skipping the part where I tell you it's loud and old, and somehow still around. You already know that. What we're doing is going into the parts nobody talks about, the sound as an actual weapon. The men who flew it, knowing there was barely a way out if it went wrong. The reactor, yes, an actual nuclear reactor that the Soviets put inside one of these things just to see what would happen. And the strange, quiet second life this same airplane lived, not as a bomber, but as a diplomat's private jet. Let's get into it. First, the sound, because the sound is not a side effect, it's a system. The Tu-95 runs on 4 Kuznetsov NK-12 engines, each one spinning a pair of contra-rotating propellers, 2 sets of blades on the same shaft, turning in opposite directions. Soviet engineers did this because they needed an obscene amount of thrust out of a propeller-driven aircraft, and the only way to get it was to push those blade tips past Mach 1. So they did, and it worked. But it came with a side effect that nobody really planned for, and definitely nobody solved. The noise didn't behave like normal aircraft noise. It didn't just announce the plane, it preceded it. NATO pilots would report hearing a bear well before ground radar had confirmed a solid track. The sound arrived like an advanced scout, tipping everybody off that the main event was still a few minutes out. And here's the part that turns this from a fun fact into an actual strategic headache. Sound doesn't stop at the surface of the ocean. It keeps going down. A supersonic propeller tip times 4 generates a seriously distinct acoustic signature. Distinct enough that passive sonar systems and sonobuoys dropped from patrol aircraft could sometimes pick up a bear flying miles overhead in the sky. Now sit with that for a second. Because one of this aircraft's actual combat jobs in its maritime reconnaissance role was to sneak up on an American carrier group, find it, and quietly hand off targeting information to a missile submarine lurking somewhere beneath the waves. Sneaking, that was the job. And the plane doing the sneaking was, in some cases, easier to detect with a hydrophone underwater than it was to spot visually in open sky. That's not a footnote in the story of this aircraft. That's a structural contradiction sitting right in the middle of its entire purpose. The Hunter was broadcasting its own position to the exact type of listener it needed to avoid. And it never really got fixed. It just got lived with, which, as we're about to see, is basically the theme of this entire airplane's existence. Now let's go inside, because if the outside of this aircraft was loud and imposing, the inside was telling a very different, much grimmer story. There are no ejection seats in a Tu-95. Not one. Not for the pilot, not for the navigator, not for anybody. The logic at the time was blunt and purely mathematical. Ejection systems are heavy, they're complicated. They eat into the payload and range numbers that this entire aircraft existed to maximize. So the engineers made the call. Cut them. save the weight, add the range. On paper, that's a simple trade-off. In practice, it meant that if this aircraft ever went down, your odds of walking away depended almost entirely on where you happened to be sitting that day. The forward crew pilots, navigators, engineers had exactly one option: a hatch built into the nose landing gear bay, not a seat that fires you clear of the fuselage in half a second, a physical crawl to a hole in the floor, followed by a jump and a prayer that your parachute deploys before the ground does. But the crew in the back, the tail gunner, the radio operator manning the defensive cannons, they had a completely separate arrangement. Their own dedicated escape door, built into the rear of the aircraft, totally disconnected from the front. Same airplane, two different emergency plans, because the crew at the tail was physically walled off from the crew up front by a long pressurized crawl space, and tons of fuel sitting in between them. That's not one safety system with a backup. That's two half systems, stitched together because survivability was never actually a design requirement from day one. It was patched in afterward, wherever there happened to be room. And then there was the cold. Bear crews weren't just flying long missions. They were flying them out of bases scraped into the Arctic tundra, positioned specifically to put American targets within range over the North Pole. And the NK-12 engine had a very inconvenient relationship with extreme cold. The gearbox lubricant would thicken up and threaten to seize if the engine sat too long without running. So at these frozen forward bases, ground crews couldn't just let the aircraft sit on alert, fueled and ready, the way American B-52 crews famously did under Operation Chrome Dome. Soviet doctrine leaned instead on rapid surge readiness, which sounds efficient until you realize what it actually meant on the ground. Every few hours, someone had to fire the engines back up, just to keep the oil warm enough that the plane could theoretically start when it mattered. Imagine being the crew chief on that rotation, every single night, all winter, keeping 4 Cold War monsters just barely alive enough to threaten a nuclear strike on command. That's not the glamorous Cold War image you usually get. That's shift work in a frozen hangar, babysitting an engine so it doesn't seize before Doomsday. Now let's talk about the reactor, because this is the part of the story that sounds made up, and I promise you it isn't. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had a genuinely wild idea. What if a bomber never had to land? What if you could build an aircraft with effectively unlimited range, powered not by fuel, but by a nuclear reactor sitting right there in the fuselage? They actually built it. It was called the Tu-95 LAL, and it carried a real, functioning nuclear reactor on board, purely as a research platform to study what radiation would do to the crew and the airframe over time. This wasn't a propulsion system yet. It was step one. Prove the concept works, then figure out how to actually run the engines off it. The reactor wasn't shielded the way you'd want it to be for a production aircraft. So the crew flying this thing wore heavy, lead-lined protective gear just to sit in the cockpit next to an active reactor core for research flights that ran from 1961 into the late 1960s. And then, it just quietly stopped. The dream of an aircraft that could stay airborne indefinitely ran headfirst into the reality that shielding a reactor properly meant adding weight nobody could afford, and the risk of an in-flight incident with an active nuclear core was, unsurprisingly, considered a bit much even by Cold War standards. The irradiated test aircraft reportedly still exists today, sitting at a Russian airbase, still carrying the radioactive legacy of a program that never got past the experimental stage. A genuine flying nuclear reactor, built and tested, then quietly shelved and left to become a footnote, in an airplane whose entire reputation is built on being a nuclear bomber. Just not that kind. Now, for the twist you really don't see coming. Everything so far has been about the bear as a weapon, noise as a warning system, crews with unequal odds of survival, an actual reactor bolted into the fuselage, all Cold War menace. But this same basic airframe also lived a second life, as a tool of diplomacy. The civilian derivative, the Tu-114, was essentially the Bear's airliner twin. Same wings, same engines, same unmistakable shape, just reconfigured to carry passengers instead of nuclear payloads. And in September 1959, this aircraft carried Nikita Khrushchev himself to the United States for his historic visit that included that now famous stop at Andrews Air Force Base. Here's the detail that never makes it into the highlight reel. The Tu-114 sat so high off the ground because of that same tall landing gear designed for the bomber version that American ground crews reportedly couldn't get a normal set of airport stairs to reach the door. A custom mobile staircase had to be sourced just so the Soviet premier could actually get off his own airplane. Sit with that image for a second. The most intimidating bomber in the Soviet arsenal. So tall that it accidentally became a logistical problem the moment it tried to be polite. That's the real character of this aircraft. It's not one thing. It's not just the terror weapon, buzzing NATO airspace for 4 decades. It's also the awkward, oversized airliner that embarrassed an entire airport's ground crew because nobody built stairs tall enough for a Cold War bomber wearing a business suit. And that contradiction, menace and absurdity sitting side by side in the same design, is honestly the best way to understand why this aircraft has survived as long as it has. It was never elegant. It was never comfortable. It was loud enough to give away its own position, dangerous enough that half the crew had a worse escape plan than the other half, and ambitious enough that somebody actually strapped a nuclear reactor to it just to see what would happen. But every single one of those flaws got absorbed instead of fixed, because the airframe underneath all of it was fundamentally sound, efficient, reliable in the ways that actually mattered for a strategic bomber. Range, payload, endurance, and that's really the through line here. This is not the story of a perfect weapon. It's the story of an imperfect one that nobody could afford to fully replace. So generation after generation of Soviet, and later Russian, engineers just kept patching around the same set of 90-year-old compromises. The gearboxes got better, the missiles got longer range, the radar got upgraded. But the core bargain, trade comfort and safety for range and payload, never actually changed. Which is maybe the most Cold War thing about this entire aircraft. It was never meant to be flown forever. It was meant to be flown just long enough. And 70 years later, it's still doing exactly that.